Our second panel today is about a package of bills that are working their way through the legislature on bail reform. So I'm going to hand the microphone over to our moderator and we'll get started.
All right, can everybody hear me okay in the back? If I could just get a thumbs up. Awesome. My name is Aiden Cotter. I work for the Vera Institute of Justice. And for those of you who do not know Vera, we are a 60-year-old organization that takes a really data-driven approach to trying to reform the criminal legal system. First, I want to thank Safe and Just for organizing this important discussion. And it really is important. At any given time across the US, there are over 500,000 people in jail awaiting trial. Fully 2/3 of people in jails are people across the country that are presumed innocent. And I also want to share with y'all that bail reform is it's an issue that matters to me personally. I spent about 10 years as a public defender, first in New York and then also spending some time in Colorado. And in that almost decade as a public defender, I can tell you that I saw firsthand countless clients lose their jobs because they were being detained pre-trial. Countless clients lose their housing, and that of course just snowballs. I've also seen numerous clients plead guilty simply to get out of jail for no other reason than they didn't have the money to buy their way out of jail. And often when people hear bail, I think sometimes we need to step back and remember that this is a practice affecting people who are pre-trial, meaning they've been arrested, they've been charged, but they have not yet had their day in court. And so cash bail is the process by which we allow certain people to buy their freedom and they get to go home and await their day in court, whereas others that do not have the money to do so must wait in jail for days, weeks, months, sometimes even years. And this is the very definition of a two-tier system of justice. Now, often when we hear this term bail reform, it can be fraught. There's a lot of misinformation. It can vary so widely. So I just want to take a quick second to just give a little context to what we mean by bail reform here in Michigan. As I'm sure most of y'all know, a task force was put together a couple years ago to study the criminal system in Michigan. And one of the important findings was that many people were being held on low-level offenses simply because they did not have the money to post bail. This bill that we're talking about in Michigan, it would have a small number of nonviolent offenses for which a person does not need to pay money to be free pre-trial. And for the vast majority of offenses, the judge would actually need to look closely at all of the factors and really explain their reasoning in terms of why they're coming to a decision of release or detention. And I don't want to get too in the weeds on the bill here because we just don't have that time, but if you have any specific questions, please find me after the panel. I'd be happy to discuss them with you. But I think it is fair to say that this package would provide some relief to those that are trapped in a cycle of poverty. It would provide relief to business owners who need workers, and it would benefit taxpayers who would rather see their money put to better use. So again, my perspective is one that comes from practicing outside of Michigan. It comes from working on national bail issues. But today we really wanted you to hear from people within your community, and they can explain how they come to this from different perspectives. So I would love to introduce you to the panel, and that way you can hear from Michiganders why this issue is important. I'm going to start with Jonathan. Jonathan Meyer is the operations manager at Abcor Industries, where he oversees several departments, including human resources. Working directly with the Michigan Department of Corrections and local field offices, John identifies employee candidates even before those candidates begin parole. Impressively, throughout 2019, every Abcor shift was successfully managed by an active parolee. John also works with Man Up, which focuses on helping men who are returning from jail or prison to get back on their feet and find work. So John, we really appreciate the perspective that you're going to give to the panel. So I guess first I would ask if you could introduce yourself to everybody and maybe kick things off by explaining from your perspective how you see the cash bail system affecting a person's ability to maintain employment.
Good morning, everybody. My name is John Meyer. As Aiden said, I'm the operations manager for Abcor Industries. We are the largest wood powder coating operation in the U.S., second largest in the world by volume. As Aiden just said, a couple years ago, every single one of our shifts was managed by somebody that was on parole. And that means, you know, from timekeeping to safety, security, human resources, everything. You know, that's a lot of trust that we put in our people. We deliberately go into the Michigan Department of Corrections to hire people. I was talking with somebody yesterday who's getting ready to get paroled, and he's going to come join us. We're going to give him a place to live. We're going to give him some accountability. We're going to give him a job, and yeah, so it's going to be awesome. Bail for me is kind of interesting because a lot of our employees will get picked up from time to time for something from their past, from 6 months ago or 9 months ago, and all of a sudden now they've got their lives turned around, now they're working, now they're a productive member of society, they're not out doing nefarious acts or anything like that, but then the sheriff pulls up and they've got a warrant, right? So, and it could be for trespassing, it could be for, you know, who knows. And then that person needs to come up with the money, or their family does, to get out, right? And it is an absolute fact that 40% of Americans don't have $400 in an emergency. If you look at what the average bail is, whether it's Macomb, Oakland, or Kent, Ottawa, Muskegon, anywhere, Kalamazoo, right, you're talking over $500, okay? So are you gonna miss your house payment? Are you gonna miss your car payment? You're gonna stay in jail and lose your job, right? You know, that's why it's kind of a personal thing to me. I served 6 years with the Michigan Department of Corrections. I got out, Abcor hired me, and this is something that's real near and dear to my heart. So thanks.
Thanks, John. Next, I want to introduce you to Alicia Dyer. Alicia spent about 7 years as a deputy sheriff with Washtenaw County Sheriff's Department. While Washtenaw is often thought as a more wealthy area of the state because of its population center in Ann Arbor, it also includes areas that face serious economic challenges. She's currently with the Civil Rights, Inclusion, and Opportunity Department with the City of Detroit, and she's a research assistant with Poverty Solutions. She's pursuing a joint MPP and MSW at the University of Michigan, and she is a seasonal law enforcement officer. Alicia, we really appreciate you being here today to share the law enforcement perspective. You know, I would like you to introduce yourself, and I'll also kick it off with a question. One thing that opponents of bail reform often claim is that bail reform hurts public safety. Would you share your perspective as a law enforcement officer as to whether the system of cash bail actually protects public safety?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Alicia Dyer from Washtenaw County. I'm a licensed law enforcement professional, and I worked road patrol in Washtenaw County with the majority of my career in Ypsilanti Township for about 7 years. And, you know, this sits really near and dear to my heart because I had a front row seat to seeing how bail really hurt public safety. You know, when someone was arrested, whether it be for a traffic ticket that they couldn't pay, where they got a bench warrant afterwards, or, you know, really low level offenses, ending up in jail, you know, even for a day or two, puts their employment at risk. It puts their family at risk. It can be harmful for children in homes. And I really saw, you know, I signed up, you know, to be a law enforcement officer to help my community. I cared about my community. I worked in an area where I was from. And I did not sign up to arrest people because they can't afford a traffic ticket. I did not sign up to sort of be a pawn to enforce this cash bail system, which I really saw dramatically hurting our community. And on the flip side, you know, because of the cash bail system, I've actually seen I recall one situation where we had a homicide suspect. The judge assumed that they couldn't pay bail, so they set a high bail amount, and they actually got out. And so, you know, I think my biggest thing is money should not determine safety. And I have just seen that happen over and over again. And so that's the perspective that I'm going to be bringing today. Thank you.
And now I'd like to introduce Representative Stephen Johnson. For those of you that do not know Representative Johnson, he has served the state of Michigan since 2017. And he's actually one of the sponsors on the package of pretrial bills that we've referenced here today. So Representative Johnson, if you could introduce yourself for folks that don't know you. And I would love to kick it off by asking, as a principled conservative, what drew you to the issue of bail reform?
Well, thank you. So yes, I'm Steve Johnson. I'm a state rep from the west side of the state, west side, best side, we like to say. Cover Wayland to Kentwood, part of Allegan, part of Kenton County. And yes, I'm a very strong conservative. I'm proud of that. And a lot of times people say, well, then why are you on this issue? And when it was initially brought to me, I was skeptical, right? For my side, we hear what's going on in places like San Francisco and New York City and go, wait a minute, we don't want that. And then as the issue was explained, what is actually these bills are doing, it made a lot of sense, because you are presumed innocent until proven guilty. And yet we have a system where, and understandably, right, someone breaks the law, you have to put them in court or in jail, and there's a process. But so many people are stuck there for a long time, and they haven't had their day in court yet. So many people are being given a bail that just doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit the crime. I'm not someone who's opposed to cash bail. I'm not opposed to, I understand that we're trying to do a motivation to make sure someone shows up for their court date. That makes sense. But the dollar amount is going to change from person to person, because $50 might be a big motivator to someone, and someone else it's not. $1 million is a big motivator to everyone, but some people, they're never going to have access to that. And so you have to make sure that what happens is the amount actually fits the crime, actually fits their situation. And instead what we're seeing, and I'm not trying to attack judges, but I think we all get in this habit of kind of getting lazy. And what we're seeing is that judges just sort of get into this form of, they just assign the same thing over and over again and not look at each case individually and say, look, this person doesn't have access to tons of money. So it would make no sense to do this high bail amount that they're never going to be able to make. Instead, they're going to sit in jail on a non-violent minor offense, probably sitting there longer than what the offense is going to actually, even if they were convicted of, land them in jail for. It just doesn't make sense. And as a taxpayer, I want to make sure that we're using our taxpayer dollars wisely, and it costs a lot of money to put someone in jail, especially if they're not even guilty yet. So to me, this made a lot of sense. And then there was, I don't know if you remember, goodness, a few months ago now, in Waukesha, Wisconsin, there was that driver who killed a number of people in a parade. And all of a sudden it came out, he was out on bail. You go, wait a minute, this does not make any sense. And a lot of people say, see, look what you're trying to push here. Look how dangerous this is. And so I started to have reservations. Like, all right, we need to look and see what happened here. Well, it turns out this guy had a rap sheet of 80 pages long. Why was he out on bail? It really didn't make a lot of sense in that case. And that's what this legislation does so well, is it requires a judge to say why they're doing what they're doing. Whether that's a really low amount for someone who has a rap sheet as long as we can see and probably should be in jail, or, and one of the bigger issues, someone that you're putting a really high bail on that has no way of ever paying that for a very minor offense. Regardless of what they're doing, the judge should have to put on paper an answer for why they're doing what they're doing, instead of the current method where it's really just kind of copy-paste from one to the next. So I think the bills that we've introduced, it's not New York, it's not San Francisco, it's really a smart, targeted way to make sure that we're treating each case individually, because everyone's case is differently. And that's why we elect judges. We don't elect judges to, we're not having a computer system just spit out things. No, we're having someone to look at everything individually and look at that specific case. And that's what these do. You should not be in or out of jail based off of the amount of money in your bank account. It should be based off of the offense you committed and the danger you are that you pose to society. And I think these bills strike that balance.
John, I'm going to turn back to you. I know that in your work, you're deeply committed to the idea that the ability to maintain employment is central to a person's sense of dignity. Can you talk about how the current cash bail system threatens that sense of dignity and the consequences that can come from that?
Sure. Thank you. So let's say somebody gets picked up on a trespassing charge or something like that, or one of our employees that works second shift went grocery shopping at 2 in the morning and happened to run into law enforcement. They got stopped. They had a warrant that was old, and it was actually a traffic warrant that they ended up getting picked up on. they were so worried about whether they were going to have a job or not that they were willing to just plead guilty just to get away from it, get out of it, things like that. And in some cases, if it's a traffic violation, I get that. But if it's something else, you know, that's you know, when you're facing something like, I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to lose my house, I'm going to lose my car, I'm going to lose my family, I'm going to lose my medical insurance, all that, it really means something. And, you know, even at $15 an hour is a $600 gross minus your taxes and some other stuff, you're, you know, probably going to be about $450 take home. How are you going to afford a $500 bail, right? And all bail is to ensure that you're going to show up for the next evolution of that prosecution, right? Until the thing's adjudicated. So up until then, you're innocent until proven guilty, but also all you're doing is saying, yes, I promise I'll be there. Most people in here know what a PR bond is. That's personal recognizance, meaning like, I promise I will show up to court, you know, on that date at that time. You don't have to take my money. I don't want to lose my job. I've been fortunate enough, and one of our owners of Abcor has been fortunate enough to drive people to court, right? And we're fortunate that we're in Ottawa County. Ottawa County, you know, they like to work with people, especially people with jobs. So, you know, at an arraignment, you know, some of these people will say like, no, I have a job. I make $15 an hour, or $20 an hour, whatever it is. I'm a productive member of society. I'm not out doing bad things. You know, the accountability and some of the other things that go along with, you know, with that respect and things like that of having the job, that says a lot. So, yeah, it's something really near and dear, and it's something that we can get out and practice right now. So, thank you.
Thank you, John. And one thing I just want to reiterate that John mentioned is, you know, sometimes people pleading guilty just because it's a way to be done and get out of jail. And I'll reiterate that that is something I saw countless times in my practice. And I think we have to really think about whether that instills any trust in the system when we have people pleading guilty simply to get out of jail. Alicia, I want to come back to you. I know that, as I said in your bio, one of the positions you have now is a research assistant with Poverty Solutions. And of course, you have your perspective as a law enforcement officer. So I am curious how you see the cash bail system playing into that cycle of poverty.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I think that it's no secret that there's a lot of longstanding things in our criminal legal system that criminalize poverty. And when I think about you know, cash bail, you know, in the DC, you know, got rid of the cash bail system for the most part in the 1960s. And you're seeing other areas do that as well. And something that, you know, I think back on my road patrol experience, I remember we had gotten in a vehicle chase, and you know, you would think, you know, someone's fleeing. A car was stopped for a pretty minor offense. I believe that it was a speeding offense, ends up in a vehicle chase. When we end up catching up with the driver that was driving the car, they fled because they had a bunch of traffic warrants. They were literally in a work uniform, on their way to work, broke down, and from there, what happens is now you have a fleeing and eluding charge. And then their car was impounded, and so then you also have this cycle of when you get pulled over with warrants and it's, you know, due to not being able to pay the fines and fees, or you can't afford the bail, your car might get impounded, then you can't get your car out of the impound lot, and you just see these dramatic effects from this. And it really also makes our jobs as law enforcement this much harder. You know, if this person could afford the fines and fees and didn't have to worry about bail, would they have even fled in the first place, right? And so we really want to have a system in place so that way, you know, our jobs is safer and easier, and the community is safer. And so I think that when you look at this criminalizing poverty cycle, whether it's the fine and fee systems, the you know, sitting in jail, you know, I would run into countless people in jail that I knew from the community that were just in there for, whether it was a possession, you know, of you know, marijuana before marijuana was legalized in Michigan charge, whether it was failure to pay speeding tickets, down to trespassing, just these really low-level offenses, and they were sitting in jail when they could be out actually working, providing for their families. And, I also worked with a lot of youth when I was in law enforcement, and I would see how some of these policies really hurt the children in the home as well, because now you have the trauma in the family from having incarcerated parent. Research shows that adverse childhood experiences with our young people having a parent incarcerated is one of those things that really cause a lot of toxic stress. And so it's the ripple effects in the whole family cycle, the community, that this bail system has been propping up. But yes, thanks.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to turn back to you, Representative Johnson. Representative Johnson, one thing that I know I really respect about you is that you are very upfront and open about the importance of your faith and how that dictates different decisions that you make. So I would love to hear from your perspective the faith-based reason for reforming the cash bail system.
Well, that's a great question. I'm a Christian myself, and happy to speak to anyone that has questions about that. And one of the important things about Christianity is making sure that you treat each individual as an individual, and making sure that there is one of the beauties, I believe, of Jesus Christ is that we are all sinners. Every single one of us, and every single day, we sin. We make mistakes. And yet, despite that, there's a God that loves us so much that was willing to send his only son for us to redeem us and to provide that forgiveness for us. Now, there has to be judgment in our society. I understand that. But we also have to make sure that we're willing to look at individuals and say, look, we have to have some forgiveness and some mercy for people too. If people are making very minor, non-violent offenses, it doesn't mean we just say we don't act like it didn't happen. Of course we have to act like it happened. But we have to understand that just throwing them behind bars, that's not always the best way to look at something like that. And then when you compound that on, there hasn't even been a conviction in most of these cases. They're just there waiting for their time. Last night, I heard from a constituent actually talking about this issue. There's an individual who, and I don't even know the nature of the crime, received an $8,000 bond. Paid it, is out, everything's going, shows up to court, and the judge says, hey, did you make a deal with the prosecutor yet? And he said, no, I'm not making a deal. I want to go to court on this one. And then the judge goes ahead and turns it into a $200,000 bond. Wait a minute. He was out on $8,000. You were fine with that. He did nothing wrong. But because he didn't reach a deal, now you just upped it to essentially put him behind bars. And what is going on here is the judge is sick of having this case in his docket and doesn't want a prolonged trial and just make the deal. And so if I raise this high enough, you'll make the deal, we're good to go. The judge can go to lunch on time. That's a problem. That's a significant problem. And that's the instance where we're not treating people fairly. We're not treating people justly. We're not treating individuals as individuals. And so that's where I look at this system and say, look, this is broken. It's not working the way it's supposed to. And I think the measures that we put forward help address that. It helps fixes that. We're not, this isn't a soft on crime piece of legislation. This is making sure that we're being smart about how we approach these situations and understanding the differences from one case to the next. When you throw someone behind bars, that's a serious thing to do. Doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do, but it's a serious thing to do. You can never give someone the liberty back for the years that they were there. And so you better have a darn good reason. And what we do right now is not providing a reason. It is this copy-paste method of you come in, we throw you behind, and here's the form, and we don't even really care about your ability to pay. My faith calls me to look out for the poor. And just because the poor can't afford bail doesn't mean that they should be locked up. If someone came to me and said, hey, you got a $1,000 bail you got to pay, I can pay it. I'm not going to like paying it, but I can pay it. Not everyone is in that situation. And so that's why we have to get this fixed.
So as part of the work that I do is we look at data across the country. We look at data when places have undergone bail reform. And one thing that we've seen is that prior to a jurisdiction undergoing bail reform and after, the rate at which people return to court does not decrease. Yet there is this idea out there that if people don't pay money, they won't come back to court. John, one thing you mentioned, I heard you say PR bond, so I know you're familiar with that term. And I'm sure you've had some of your employees that are released without having to pay money bond. So I would be curious if you've seen those employees still come back to court. And also if you could talk about what barriers are in place that as a society we need to address to help people get back to court.
Thank you. Excuse me. So yeah, we've seen that before with you know, when somebody is bonded out or you know, they have their arraignment, their pre-trial, all those kinds of things, they still show up, right? This isn't Dog the Bounty Hunter TV show, okay? And so I have in my history of working with Abcor, or let's just say in the last 10 years, I don't believe I've ever met somebody that consciously and deliberately didn't show up for court, for their day in court. Now, granted, you know, somebody's going to run or somebody's going to do something like that. That's right. Whether they paid $100 or not, you know, if their intent is to run, then they're going to run. But when it comes to like the PR bonds and things like that, you know, I mean, in TV, they surrender their passports and they do all that kind of stuff. I mean, let's be real, right? You know, and everybody is innocent until proven guilty. Everybody's due their day in court, right? So by some people not, you know, by just pleading guilty or by setting such a high bail that people can't get out, that's not fair. And that doesn't change whether or not that person is more or less dangerous or whether or not that person's going to show up for court. So there is a hybrid way. Look, everybody in this room is paying for the people that are in those jails right now, right? Those are people that aren't working, that aren't contributing to our society, that aren't paying taxes, that aren't, you know, that aren't doing the right thing. So, I mean, I could say I would much rather have, you know, more people out of jail working and doing things. And if somebody is a danger to society, right, then we absolutely, you know, have to justify, you know, a bond. Like I have no doubt that judges could say, this is why I charged $1 million because the crime was this, and this person probably has a history of flight or things like that. So, but on other things, it's like, no, this person's never been in trouble with the law before, ever, right? And then you set a bond so high that yeah, you did give them a bond, but there's no way somebody's going to make that, and that's just wrong. There's nothing okay about that. So I think before I was just talking about, you know, are we locking people up because we're mad at them, or are we locking people up because we're scared of them? Think about it. It's the money. Thank you.
So Alicia, one thing you mentioned in one of your answers was about, you know, people don't go into law enforcement, generally speaking, to, you know, write somebody a ticket or lock somebody up forgetting to pay a ticket. I know you can't speak for all law enforcement. I know you can't speak for folks in corrections, but I would be curious how you see the current system affecting, one, officer morale, and two, interactions in relationship with the local community that they serve.
Yeah, so you know, one thing I'll speak to, you know, inside the jail is, you know, it is no secret that we are running on shortages in the jails, in prisons. The pandemic really put a lot of stress on the workers inside as well as the community. And so having people incarcerated that don't need to be there is counterproductive to the workers inside that have to work in the jail. And on the outside for law enforcement, again, it just makes our jobs that much harder because it's really hard to protect the public when you know that you're also required to enforce these traffic warrants and these minor low-level offenses. We become the bad guys, right? We are the pawns in the front of the system, and so we are that first contact with people. And I think back on, when I've done traffic stops for, speeding or reckless driving or whatever have you, and how scared people are in general just because of the situation of being on a traffic stop. But then also knowing, 5 years ago, I have a warrant on my record that I haven't gotten taken care of, and I'm going to lose my job if I go to jail, or this is going to happen to me. That really escalates the situation, and it really makes things unsafe for everyone, and it makes our jobs, again, that much harder. And something else that I really want to also bring up is this reality where people will plead guilty just to get out of jail to be able to go and make ends meet again. Then we're not getting the real person that committed the crime. So, and that really discredits law enforcement in general. And so that's also a big problem that this system is perpetuating. It's one thing that if you did it, you did it. But if I remember talking to a young person that was in jail that really wanted to plead guilty, even though we had evidence that they did not do this crime. And they were in there for some warrants for something unrelated. And, it's sort of, as you talked about during your career as a defense attorney, the last thing we want is to have someone incarcerated for something they did not do. And this hurts the credibility of, law enforcement that are in the community as well.
And Representative Johnson, I want to ask you a couple of questions specifically about the pretrial package that has been introduced, since you're one of the sponsors. And you have spoken about some of these things in your answers, but I guess to ask you to speak on two things directly. One, how do you see this bill fitting in line with the Constitution and the ideas of presumption of innocence and due process? And also, can you speak to how you see this bill as being in support and respecting taxpayers?
Yeah, so there's several things in here. Obviously, let's take, I think a lot of people, most people in this room would say, if you looked at the shooting that happened in Oxford, that shooter, most would say, I understand the trial hasn't occurred yet, but that's someone that's a danger. That's someone I think we say, all right, there is reason to keep someone like that behind bars until we get to that date. And so you have your presumption of innocence, but there are cases where you say, hey, because of this situation, because of the grievous nature of the crime, because of the likelihood to flee, because of the danger to society, we're not saying get rid of, no one can be behind bars until that date. But we have to understand that we have to be very careful about when those instances occur. And really, this legislation, to me, it seems very basic. One of the requirements is that the judge actually has to figure out what is that person, what is the defendant's financial position. Right now, we have judges making decisions about someone, and they don't even know if this person's a multimillionaire or if this person is dead broke. Well, it seems like that's a pretty important thing to know before you're issuing a bond. And I think that's when you look at our constitutional requirements, where, look, you are innocent until proven guilty, you have the right to speedy trial. There's a number of things that I don't think are really happening the way that they're supposed to. And this legislation helps get there. And then as far as the taxpayers go, the taxpayers are the ones footing the bill. Now, most taxpayers are fine having prisons. There are bad guys out there. Everyone's in agreement. We want to lock some people up. But as to your point earlier, are we locking them up because we're mad at them or because we're afraid of them? If they're a true danger to society, they need to be locked up. If we're just angry at them, well, then we have to have the conversation, is that really worth it? Because now we have to take money from everyone to make that happen. And now as a society, we are poorer for that action. This legislation, I think, really does a good balance of trying to make sure that bad guys can go to jail, but that people do not sit in jail merely because of the amount of money in their bank account. So right now, this bill is in the Judiciary Committee. There's bipartisan support, both Democrat, Republicans on this. We're hoping to have a hearing on this soon and really have that conversation, because I think most people know what's going on isn't working. And I think in standard general terms, the law enforcement community generally just opposes stuff like this. And the more you start to talk it through, the more I'm hearing from them saying, no, this actually makes a lot of sense. the opposition is basically these arguments being made that this does something it doesn't. That this is just completely getting rid of all this, and anyone's going to go be able to rob a store, do the smash and grab, and you can't even throw them in jail, and there's never going to be any accountability for anyone's actions. That's not what this bill does. Not even close to what it does. But that's what some of the opposition out there is trying to kind of portray as, oh, this is just letting criminals run free. No such thing. If you're a bad criminal, if you're a danger to society, you're going to be locked up. But we're not locking you up purely because you don't have any money. That is not anything that should ever be in the equation. It should be purely off of what danger do you pose to society. And I hate to cut and run here, but I have a noon committee that I've got to run across the street to, but I really appreciate your support of this. I appreciate everyone here. Hopefully we can get a hearing on this soon and get this legislation passed out.
So I would gladly sit all day and ask these guys questions, but we only have about 10 minutes left, and we would like to just open up the floor for y'all to ask some questions.
I'm going to have a question in here somewhere, but I just want to acknowledge, so every state's different in how bail, and one thing that Representative Johnson referred to is that our court rules do cover the two bases, which is supposed to be returning to court and also safety for the victim or for the public. But what happens, and I will say this right now, as an elected prosecutor and a former assistant prosecutor in the 80s and 90s, that what I saw routinely was some of the things alluded to. People would come in, they were in jail for a misdemeanor, and we would routinely say, we'll give you credit time served. You can plead today, credit time served, and it was never our intent that they plead guilty to something they didn't do, but the effect of, I started seeing that that's what was happening. With felonies, one of the things that was really challenging and hasn't been specifically mentioned is I saw, because of bail bondsmen, which I'm not a fan of, 10% bonds. What happens is I saw families mortgaging their homes, taking their life savings and though that 10% never comes back. So once you post that, it goes to the bail bondsman and it never comes back, even if everyone, someone shows up to courts, found not guilty. So those are some things that are, really troubling. So I think that we have to focus, and what I've seen, even with talking with judges since I've been back as an elected prosecutor, is that it's very pro forma. Even now that we're having more in the way of what does, there was just a $4 million bond set on an attempted assault intent murder in Clinton County the other day. What was that based on versus somebody who might, be out on considerably less for a homicide? So how do you factor in what needs to be looked at? And some places have pretrial services that really do start to look at that, or a public defender who does. But it really does need to be linked to those two considerations, public safety and coming back to court, and not putting someone in a situation where they are basically losing their constitutional rights because of that. So there was no question there, I'm so sorry, but
Yes, my name is Marcus Kelly, and I was a victim of wrongful conviction. I lost 9 years of my life. I didn't get to see my mother because she passed with brain cancer. I've been home 2 years, and I've been trying to get my life back on track. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder as a result. I was brutally beaten by the officers. I still get fidgety when I see police, when I get followed. Still get harassed, but in the process, to try to be able to get through it, I built a program called Pathway for Success to try to help individuals just come home from prison, get their life back on track, since now I know how it feels to be a returning citizen. And so I've been trying to build fundraisers up to help grow the program. Right now, I just got 10 people that's involved. Still going back and forth with the courts about reimbursement. It's like hard trying to be reimbursed. They take 9 years out of your life and then in 10 minutes and take you years to get reimbursed for it. And I'm going through that now. So I still go around and talk to people about it, tell them how my experience has been. I just seen a guy just today come home after 25 years with a murder case when we was in high school. He did 25 years and just got his case overturned when they knew he was innocent 4 years ago. My case, they knew I was innocent in 2013 when they fired all the cops in my case. And my case was all over the news. And I just let me go in February of 2020, 7 years later. And so I appreciate the talks about, bail and stuff like that, because I think a lot of those kind of things need to be reformed, especially people that's living in poverty in the small pockets of the world that doesn't have the money to pay for attorneys. And, and even with that, attorneys that still, want to fight for justice rather than just take a penny and push the poor people to the side and help somebody that actually has money. And I appreciate where you said the judges should actually look at an individual's case and his profile before they make a decision on bail. And because that's very important, because you have a guy like me coming there that has a job, has a family, but I'm living check to check, and they say, okay, do you got money to pay? No, you're buying $250,000, no 10%. Lose your job, lose your house, can't pay a lawyer, and now you lose 9 years of your life because you can't. So I was asking, if anybody ever know anybody that been through those kind of things, could y'all probably reach out, send to my organization and, help guys that's come home like me that have been wrongfully convicted. And maybe we can talk to the state or legislatures and stuff and ask them to don't hold back justice, actually, kind of make things right instead of kind of lingering things on when you just took somebody's life from them. So that's all I really had to say.
Thank you for sharing that story. I absolutely agree with you. Something we've been doing in Washtenaw is we've been working with the organization of exonerees, because we are finding there's so many people wrongfully convicted in our legal system. And, as a former law enforcement, I'll say we have a long way to go in this country to get to a place where we actually have safety in communities and people aren't wrongfully convicted and people aren't held in jail because they can't afford to pay $100 bond. Even $100 has kept people behind bars, and it makes no sense. And there's a lot of trauma and pain from that. Personally as a cop, I think back on all the stories and it's traumatic, like that sits with you, right? And I just think that I thank all of you guys here today. I thank you for sharing your story, and I definitely hope that we can start really seeing real change on this front in Michigan.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As I listen to the conversation regarding the cash bail, I still hear the possibility of subjectivity sliding on in, right? The presentation of possible bias coming from the bench. So my question that I would pose to you, and I know that you all are not a part of, writing this particular piece of legislation, but what would you propose as a more equitable position for the judges to be able to come from when an individual actually has to, be picked up and present before a judge. Because I know, we're talking about trauma. I'm a trauma therapist. I hear the pain all day, every day. We need to be able to remediate some of that. We're not talking about, right, just objects. We're talking about human beings, and we're talking about life. We haven't even introduced in this conversation just yet about the issues with race and how that, right, also plays a part, and that's where I'm going with the subjectivity piece of it. What would you propose as, again, an equitable, let's say, assessment tool or something of that nature that could be utilized by the judges to make certain that everyone is treated fairly and that we're not looking at, oh, okay, yeah, the behavior that you exemplified was a bit more egregious, although it's the same offenses? What would you propose?
The one thing I'll just kind of kick it off on that answer and then pass along, that I will say about this package of bills, one important aspect of it is that it takes certain offenses that are just no longer eligible to have money bail set, and that at least partially addresses the issue you're getting at, where judges are human beings and human beings have implicit biases, and those creep into those decisions. So that is one aspect of the bill. The other aspect of the bill is for those other cases where cash bail has not been taken off the table, judges can no longer get by with just setting a dollar amount and not explaining why, or not saying, I just got, I've heard judges say, I just got a feeling about that person. I just didn't like them. And to your point, sometimes there's a bias behind that. And so this package really would require judges to actually articulate exactly how they came to that decision, and then they can be held accountable for those decisions because there's something that can be reviewed. Sure.
Thank you. I agree. I think that it's really important to make a judge and almost justify why they're making the decision that they made, right? Is it based off this person's history? Like, is there a reason that you want to set a bail or a bond this high versus what everybody else is doing? But it is somewhat subjective. But if you take part of that out to where, that holds that judge accountable. So if that judge is slamming people with $100,000 bonds for this and for that, there's groups out there that are going to say, hey, this is wrong. Like, what you're doing is wrong. And, no judge wants to be in that seat, right? So, I think it's really important just to have them to justify what they're doing. And also on the other side, like, no, I don't think this person, needs a bond because they've always shown up for court, or they have a job, they have a family, they have all those anchors that keep them a productive member of society.
You guys actually covered that really well. And I'll just add on that, it's no secret we have biases in the criminal legal system. I know in some areas they're even looking at doing, taking out all identifying factors for prosecutors when they review a case report, in their decisions to authorize or deny charges. I think that this is definitely an area that we need to continue looking at and bringing awareness to. I can recall, I've heard even, the subjectivity coming in depending on a lunch hour, right? Is it the judge almost going to recess to eat lunch? Are they more likely to give a higher or lower bail in the morning? And so you even have the time, really, when we have human beings imposing restrictions on other human beings, you're going to have that bias. And I think that this is definitely an area that needs to come into play. And as Aiden was saying about, this bill is, one of the best things we can do is really, if it makes no sense for anyone to be locked up for something where they can't afford to get out and it's a low-level offense, let's not lock them up in the first place. And let's start there, because that will at least create a uniform response to some of these offenses.
Well, I would definitely love to keep this conversation going. I've been given the signal that we are at time. So I want to thank our panelists, Alicia and John. And thank you to Safe and Just, and thank you for you all to coming.
Two pieces of information. The first one is that this set of bills started its pathway through the Jails Task Force on Pretrial Incarceration here in Michigan, which was a year-long process that happened a couple of years ago. And I testified on bail in front of that committee, and a lot of what I talked about is stuff that was just handled in this panel. One of the things I did is I went and I looked at the data from all the states and localities where bail reform had passed. And one of the arguments that people generally make is that they're afraid that people won't show up for their court dates. Well, it turns out in all of the places, DC, Kentucky, New Jersey, Houston, I could go through a long list, the appearance rates are exactly the same as in places where bail reform has happened and when bail reform hasn't happened. So that argument doesn't hold a lot of weight, although it is something that people are very scared of. The other thing I think people get caught up in when they see bail reform is this notion of arguing from anecdotes. And what I mean by that is that you'll see in, for instance, the New York press, hundreds of examples of people saying, well, this person got out, got released pre-trial, and then committed a crime. That's not really the question of how you determine if these things are good or bad. What you do is you look at the rate of new offenses that are committed before bail reform, and you compare it to the rate of new offenses that are committed after bail reform. And again, even in New York, if you go, they have a data set, which I'd be glad to share with people if anyone wants to email me. The amount of new offenses that occurred before bail reform were slightly higher than after bail reform. And so they'll go, well, what about all these people who commit crimes? Before and after bail reform, some people commit crimes after they're released. That just happens. It's a question of which causes more harm. We're trying to have the safest possible communities. And bail reform, at least to the research I've done, tends to create the safest possible communities for a number of reasons. When people are radically desperate, they tend to be more likely to commit crimes, etc. And bail reform is one way to relieve that. The second thing, and I think you'll enjoy this one much more, we've actually reached the lunch break and there is food out there waiting for you. Grab some food, enjoy some lunch, talk to some folks. I'll bring some more people up and then we'll get ready for our next panel in about an hour.